Much afraid and the shepherd, together and with suffering and sorrow, kept walking through the desert. Then one day, quite suddenly, they came to a path. "This," said the shepherd quietly, "is the way you are to go." So they turned and after a while found themselves on the shore of a great sea. "It is time for me to leave you, Much Afraid," he said, "and return to the mountains. Even though you seem farther away than ever from the high places, I will still come to you quickly if you call me." He then went leaping and bounding across the desert toward the mountains, which were far behind them. Much Afraid and her two helpers walked along the shores of the great sea for many days. She began to know the name of the place where she presently journeyed. It was Loneliness. Now the mountains were out of sight. And her home in the valley was far, far away. There seemed to be nothing in the whole world except for the desert on one side and the endless, dreary sea on the other. Often an icy wind would blow, and the only sound was the lonely crying of the seagulls overhead. In those days, Much Afraid never let go of the hands of her two helpers. It was amazing how swiftly they helped her along. It was also amazing how she walked now with hardly a limp. Somehow, something had happened to her in that desert. She was learning to accept with joy the path the shepherd had given her. Although she went with sorrow and suffering day after day beside the sea of loneliness, Much Afraid felt a happiness in her heart. She even began to realize that the place was strangely beautiful. She spoke words to herself that she had read in the great book. "When he has tried me, I shall come forth as gold. Weeping may last for a night, but joy comes in the morning." Meanwhile, far away in the valley, her fearing relatives had been waiting for Pride to come back with Much Afraid. He must have not been able to make her return around and was now too proud to come back and admit that he had failed. They decided they had to send others to help him. Before Much Afraid reached the high places and was forever out of their reach, spies were sent to find Pride, and they brought back word that Much Afraid was nowhere near the mountains, but far away on the shores of Loneliness. This made her relatives very excited. They quickly agreed on who should go and help Pride bring Much Afraid back to them. Resentment, bitterness, and self-pity left right away. Have you ever met those three? Resentment is like anger. He is even as strong as hatred. If he ever tries to speak to you, do not listen. His cousin Bitterness is a sarcastic sorrow fellow. In fact, if you listen to him too much, his words act like poison to your spirit man. He holds grudges and never forgives. Self-pity is someone who seems to be around everyone at some time. He tries to get you to feel sorry for yourself. If you ever think things like, "Poor me," or "No one likes me," or "Why does it always happen to me?" watch out. This is self-pity talking to you. You need to start thinking about the Lord and other people and quit worrying about yourself. Those were the three characters who joined Pride. Off they went to the shores of Loneliness. However, her enemies soon discovered that she was not the same Much Afraid they used to know. They could not get close to her because she kept so near to sorrow and suffering. All they could do was call out to her. "I told you so," Pride shouted. "Where are you now, you little fool? Up on the high places? Ha! He's gone and left you, just like I said he would." Resentment raised his ugly head over a rock. "Who is this shepherd that you follow? Why do you let him treat you like this? He promised to take you to the high places, and here you are next to the desert." Then Bitterness sneered out from behind another rock. "The more you let him, the more he will keep doing cruel things to you. You had better turn around and leave him now before he asks even more of you." Self-pity was almost worse than the others. He spoke so softly and in such a whimpering voice that Much Afraid felt weak all over. "Poor little Much Afraid," he whispered. "You have every right to feel bad about yourself. You have been so willing and so obedient, but he keeps thinking up some new way to hurt you and cause you so much pain." This last remark was a mistake. The word pain suddenly reminded Much Afraid of the lesson she had learned in the pyramid. The threshing floor, the potter's wheel, the fiery furnace, all would cause pain, but it was necessary if she needed to be changed into what the shepherd wanted her to be. When she thought of this, To Self-Pity's shock, she picked up a piece of rock and threw it at him with all her might. But she became more and more tired of listening to the voices of her enemies. She couldn't hold her ears because sorrow and suffering were holding her. It was getting harder to resist their whining, and she was getting weaker. Finally, Much Afraid had had enough. "Shepherd," she called, "come and help me, hurry." To the horror of her enemies, there was the shepherd leaping toward them. Immediately, they ran in different directions, trying to escape. "Oh, shepherd, thank you. I didn't call you sooner because I thought I could get rid of them myself. Why couldn't I do it?" "I think," said the shepherd, "that lately you are beginning to tell yourself that it was time I led you back toward the mountains and the high places. Perhaps you have been impatient instead of acceptance with joy. Perhaps you liked what they said." Much Afraid felt her cheeks getting hot. The shepherd was right. She put her hand into his. "I've been thinking that you have led me to this path too long and that you've forgotten your promises. I'm sorry. You are my shepherd. I will trust you and follow you where you lead me." The shepherd stooped down and picked up a stone which was lying beside her feet. He smiled and said, "Put this in your bag with the other stones. It will help you remember your promise to wait patiently until I do what I said I will do." Much Afraid and her helpers walked for many, many days along the shores of loneliness. Pride, resentment, and bitterness and self-pity kept attacking her. But Much Afraid was getting stronger. She kept remembering to accept the path with joy, no matter what, and to trust the shepherd. Finally, they arrived at a different place. It was a lovely country filled with fruit trees and hills. Everywhere she looked, there were singing birds and blossoming flowers. She felt as though she had stepped out of winter and into spring. In a short while, they came to the edge of the trees, and Much Afraid gave a little cry of joy. There was the shepherd waiting to meet them. She ran toward him as though she had wings on her feet. "Oh, welcome, welcome, 1,000 times welcome," she cried, throwing herself into his big, strong arms. "I have come to bring you a message," said the shepherd, as he held her. "It is time you see what I will do." "Oh, shepherd," she cried as she pulled away from him, "do you mean that I'm finally going to look at the high places?" She thought he nodded, but he didn't answer her. He just stood there looking with a soft sort of smile. "Do you mean it? Do you mean that soon you will take me to the high places?" This time he answered, "Yes," and added with a strong, strange smile, "Now you will see what I will do." He held her another moment before leaving, and Much Afraid felt such strength was pouring into her. Much Afraid had a song in her heart as she walked among the fields and trees of that country. She continued on her happy journey for some time. One day they reached the top of one of the hills just as the sun was rising. There, not far away, were the mountains. Much Afraid thought she had never seen anything so beautiful. Finally, after such a long time, the path that Much Afraid and her two helpers traveled had turned toward the high places. Much Afraid fell on her knees and worshipped. It seemed to her that moment that all the pain and all the troubles had been worthwhile. It seemed to her also that even sorrow and suffering were smiling with her. Then, Much Afraid realized something else. She was beginning to understand the language spoken by these two sisters. She remembered that the shepherd had told her when she first met sorrow and suffering, "As you travel with them, little by little, you will learn to understand their words." As she rose to her feet, Much Afraid took their hands in hers, and the travelers started their journey once again. And that is where we will stop for today.